The Senate chamber that has witnessed 235 years of American democracy just delivered a stunning defeat to Donald Trump. Not because Democrats outnumbered Republicans, not because of some procedural maneuver. Senator Rand Paul said it himself. This should be about the Constitution versus presidential prerogative. I'm Barbara Green, and this is the channel bringing you real investigative journalism. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell. Leave a comment below telling me whether you think Congress should have the power to limit presidential war powers. Share this video with everyone you know. This is the only official channel for independent political analysis. What I'm about to show you is happening in real time across Washington, and it's spreading to every corner of our constitutional system. Here's the core argument tonight in plain language. Trump just experienced a constitutional meltdown that exposes how fragile our system of checks and balances really is. This isn't about politics, it's about power. Tonight I'm going to walk you through the Senate vote that broke Trump, the angry phone calls he made to Republican senators, and the tie-breaking moment that saved his presidency while potentially destroying our democracy. By the time we're done, you'll see exactly how we got to this constitutional crisis and who's about to pay the price. 5 Republican senators just defied their own president. Think about that. Josh Hawley, Todd Young, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, and Rand Paul crossed party lines to advance a war powers resolution that would force Trump to get congressional approval before taking further military action in Venezuela. The procedural vote was 52 to 47. Translation: even Trump's own party thinks he's gone too far. But here's what nobody is saying out loud. Within hours of that vote, Trump was on the phone, not making policy, not building consensus, making threats. And what happened next is going to blow your mind. This story starts with a shocking military operation that nobody saw coming. On January 3rd, explosions rocked the Venezuelan capital of Caracas. Military bases across the country came under attack. Hours later, Donald Trump appeared on television to announce that the United States had successfully captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and transported him to American soil to face criminal trial. Let that sink in. The sitting American president had just ordered the abduction of a foreign head of state without congressional authorization. Maduro's wife, Cilia Flores, was also captured in the operation. No advance warning to Congress, no debate about war powers, no constitutional process, just unilateral executive action that would have made the founders roll over in their graves. Senator Tim Kaine, who sits on the Armed Services Committee, told CNN, "The president cannot wage war without Congress. Period. Full stop." This is not a grey area. Translation: Trump had crossed a constitutional red line that even Republicans couldn't ignore. And here's where it becomes undeniable. The War Powers Resolution exists for exactly this reason. After Vietnam, Congress said never again would a president drag America into military conflict without legislative approval. The founders gave Congress the power to declare war for a reason. They had just fought a revolution against a king who could start wars on a whim. But Donald Trump just proved that constitutional guardrails only work if people are willing to enforce them. And for one terrifying moment last week, it looked like they might not be. The 5 Republican senators who voted to advance this resolution weren't just crossing party lines. They were choosing the Constitution over their political careers. Rand Paul, who has spent years defending executive power when it suited conservative goals, said something remarkable on the Senate floor. He said this isn't really and shouldn't be Republican versus Democrat. This should be legislative prerogative versus presidential prerogative, and it should be about the Constitution. Think about that for a moment. A libertarian Republican just chose constitutional principle over party loyalty. In today's political climate, that's practically revolutionary. Susan Collins, who faces re-election pressure in Maine, told reporters she couldn't stand by while presidential war powers expanded beyond all constitutional limits. Lisa Murkowski, representing Alaska's military families, said Congress has a duty to check executive overreach. Todd Young, a former Navy officer, said his oath was to the Constitution, not to any individual president. And Josh Hawley, who had built his career defending Trump, shocked Washington by joining the rebellion. But what came next exposed just how fragile our democratic institutions really are when they come under direct assault from the presidency itself. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. Within 3 hours of that Senate vote, Donald Trump was making phone calls. Not to foreign leaders, not to military commanders, to Republican senators. And those calls weren't about policy or strategy or national security. They were about punishment. And what happened in those phone calls is going to change American democracy forever. To understand how we got to this constitutional breaking point, you need to know what happened on January 3rd. What Donald Trump did that morning changed everything. And what's terrifying is how few Americans even know it happened. At 4:17 a.m. Eastern Time, the first explosions lit up the Venezuelan night sky. Military installations across Caracas came under coordinated attack. Within 6 hours, the most audacious military operation in modern American history was complete. Donald Trump had ordered the capture and extraction of a sitting foreign head of state without congressional authorization, without international law justification, and without telling the American people what was coming. Here's what actually happened. According to Pentagon sources who spoke to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity, Special Operations Forces, supported by Navy SEALs and Air Force precision strikes, conducted simultaneous raids on 3 Venezuelan government facilities. Their target wasn't military infrastructure, it wasn't weapons stockpiles, it was Nicolas Maduro himself. Think about that for a moment. The sitting American president ordered what amounts to a kidnapping operation against another country's leader. At 10:43 a.m., Trump appeared on television from the Oval Office to announce the operation's success. Maduro, he said, had been transported to Miami to face federal charges on drug trafficking and terrorism. His wife, Cilia Flores, who had been captured in the same operation, was being held at a secure facility pending her own legal proceedings. Senator Marco Rubio, who chairs the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, told CNN this operation was necessary to protect American national security interests in the region. The Maduro regime has been a threat to democracy and stability for years. Translation: even Republicans who supported the outcome were struggling to explain the constitutional process. But here's what Rubio didn't say, and what the White House refused to answer when pressed by reporters. Where was Congress in this decision? When exactly did Trump decide to authorize this operation? And under what legal authority did he believe he could order the abduction of a foreign leader? The War Powers Resolution, passed in 1973, requires the President to consult with Congress before introducing armed forces into hostilities. It gives the President 48 hours to notify Congress after military action begins and 60 days to get authorization for continued operations. Trump did none of this. Zero consultation, zero notification, zero authorization request. Dr. Jennifer Spindle, a constitutional law professor at the University of New Hampshire, told the Boston Globe, "What we witnessed was the complete abandonment of constitutional war powers procedures. The president acted unilaterally in a way that would have shocked the founders and violated every norm of congressional oversight. Let that sink in." The President of the United States had just proven that he could order military action against any country, capture any leader, and face zero immediate consequences as long as the operation succeeded. The constitutional guardrails that were supposed to prevent exactly this scenario had completely failed. And here's the most chilling part. The operation worked. Maduro was in custody. Venezuela's government had collapsed into chaos. American military forces controlled key installations. From a purely operational standpoint, Trump had pulled off what his advisors were calling the most successful regime change operation since Panama in 1989. But success doesn't equal legality. And what happened next in the Senate proved that some Republicans still understood the difference. Within 24 hours, Senator Tim Kaine introduced a War Powers Resolution specifically targeting Trump's Venezuela operation. The resolution was simple. It would force the president to withdraw military forces from Venezuela and require congressional authorization for any future military action in the region. This wasn't partisan grandstanding. This was constitutional preservation. And what shocked Washington was how quickly Republican support materialized. Rand Paul was the first to break ranks. In a statement released Tuesday morning, Paul said, "I swore an oath to the Constitution, not to any president. Congress has the sole power to declare war, and that power cannot be delegated away by success or popularity." Susan Collins followed within hours. Then Lisa Murkowski. Then, in a move that stunned Republican leadership, Todd Young and Josh Hawley announced their support for the resolution. Think about what this means. 5 Republican senators were willing to rebuke their own president on national security grounds during his first major military operation. This wasn't policy disagreement. This was constitutional rebellion. The procedural vote was scheduled for Thursday. Senate Majority Leader John Thune spent 3 days trying to convince Republican defectors to change their minds. He offered committee assignments, promised hearings on Venezuela policy, even suggested a compromise resolution that would give Trump retroactive authorization. None of it worked. On Thursday morning, the Senate voted 52 to 47 to advance the War Powers resolution. 5 Republicans had crossed the aisle to join all 47 Democrats in a direct rebuke of presidential authority. For the first time in Trump's presidency, his own party had officially told him he had gone too far. Senator John Cornyn, speaking for Republican leadership, told reporters this vote sends the wrong message to our adversaries and undermines the commander-in-chief during a critical military operation. Translation: even Republicans who opposed the resolution knew Trump had acted outside normal constitutional channels. But what happened next revealed the true cost of standing up to presidential power in the Trump era. Within 3 hours of that vote, every Republican senator who had crossed the aisle received a personal phone call from the president. And those calls changed everything. What happened in those phone calls will haunt American democracy for generations. Because what Donald Trump did wasn't politics. It wasn't negotiation. It was systematic intimidation of the legislative branch by the executive branch. And we know exactly what he said, because 3 of those senators immediately told their staff, and their staff talked to reporters. The first call went to Rand Paul at 2:47 p.m. According to a senior aide who spoke to Politico on condition of anonymity, Trump didn't waste time on pleasantries. The president told Paul that his vote was a betrayal of national security and that he would personally campaign against him in Kentucky if Paul didn't change his position before the final vote. But it gets worse. Trump then said, according to the aide's account, that Paul's vote was giving aid and comfort to America's enemies, and that voters in Kentucky would remember who stood with terrorists over their own president. Those aren't policy disagreements. Those are character assassinations designed to end political careers. The second call went to Susan Collins 15 minutes later. A Collins spokesperson told the Portland Press-Herald that Trump expressed deep disappointment with her vote and suggested it would be difficult for him to support main priorities if Collins continued to oppose his foreign policy decisions. Translation: support me or I'll punish your state. The third call was to Todd Young. And what Trump said to the former Navy officer reveals just how far presidential intimidation had crossed into authoritarian territory. According to a source close to Young who spoke to the Indianapolis Star, Trump questioned Young's military service and suggested that real veterans would support decisive action against America's enemies. Think about that for a moment. The sitting president just attacked a former military officer's service record because that officer voted to uphold congressional war powers. Lisa Murkowski got the fourth call. Trump, according to an aide who briefed the Anchorage Daily News, told Murkowski that Alaska's military installations and federal funding could face scrutiny if she continued to oppose administration priorities. The aide described it as the most threatening call the senator had ever received from a sitting president. Josh Hawley received the final call at 4:23 p.m. What Trump said to Hawley changed everything, because Hawley was the one senator Trump thought he could definitely flip. According to a source familiar with the conversation who spoke to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Trump offered Hawley a Supreme Court nomination in his next term if Hawley would switch his vote and help kill the War Powers Resolution. Let that sink in. The President of the United States had just offered to trade a Supreme Court seat for a senator's vote on war powers. That's not political horse trading. That's corruption of the constitutional separation of powers. But here's what makes this even more chilling. Within an hour of these phone calls, Trump took to social media to escalate the pressure campaign into public intimidation. At 5:17 p.m., he posted on Truth Social, "The 5 Republicans who voted to undermine America's successful Venezuela operation should be ashamed of themselves. They are weak, disloyal, and should never be elected to office again." He didn't stop there. In a follow-up post 20 minutes later, Trump wrote, "Rand Paul, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, Todd Young, and Josh Hawley have sided with socialists and drug dealers over American national security. Kentucky, Maine, Alaska, Indiana, and Missouri deserve better representation." Think about what this means. The president wasn't just disagreeing with their votes. He was calling for their political destruction. He was telling their constituents that these senators were enemies of America for upholding the Constitution. Dr. Julia Azari, a political scientist at Marquette University who studies executive power, told CNN, "What we're witnessing is unprecedented. Presidents have always lobbied Congress, but this systematic campaign of personal destruction against members of your own party for upholding constitutional responsibilities crosses every norm of democratic governance." And here's the most terrifying part. It was working. By Friday morning, cracks were already showing. Josh Hawley, who had built his political brand on constitutional conservatism, released a statement saying he was reconsidering his position in light of new intelligence briefings about Venezuela's threat to American interests. Todd Young, facing pressure from Indiana's military community and veterans groups, told reporters he was studying the resolution's language more carefully to ensure it didn't inadvertently harm American forces already deployed. The pressure campaign had moved from private intimidation to public character assassination to systematic political warfare. And 2 of the 5 Republican rebels were beginning to buckle. A senior aide to one of the wavering senators, speaking to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity because they weren't authorized to discuss internal deliberations, described the atmosphere as unlike anything they had experienced in 20 years on Capitol Hill. The aide said, "It's not just political pressure anymore. It's existential. He's not trying to change votes. He's trying to end careers." Translation, this isn't how constitutional democracy is supposed to work. But what happened next proved that even the most intense presidential pressure campaign can't change basic mathematics. The War Powers Resolution was heading for a final vote, and Donald Trump was about to discover that constitutional principles sometimes matter more than political survival. Or so it seemed. What none of us knew was that Trump had one more card to play. And when he played it, the entire constitutional system would face its greatest test since the Civil War. Because sometimes in American democracy, everything comes down to a single tie-breaking vote. The final vote was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 p.m. By Monday night, Trump's pressure campaign had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. 2 Republican senators who had stood on principle just days earlier were about to abandon the Constitution to save their political careers. Josh Hawley was the first to break. At 8:47 a.m. on Tuesday, his office released a statement that read like a surrender document. After careful consideration of classified intelligence briefings and consultation with Missouri military families, Hawley announced he would support a point of order against the War Powers Resolution, effectively killing it before the final vote. Translation, the Supreme Court nomination offer had worked. A senior Hawley aide, speaking to the Kansas City Star on condition of anonymity, revealed what had happened behind the scenes. The aide said Hawley had spent the weekend agonizing over the decision, calling constitutional law professors, consulting with former military officers, and meeting with Missouri veterans groups. But in the end, the aide said, Hawley concluded that opposing the president during an active military operation would hurt his political future more than abandoning constitutional principle. Think about that. A sitting senator chose career survival over constitutional duty. Todd Young followed 90 minutes later. His statement was even more devastating because it revealed the human cost of Trump's intimidation campaign. Young announced he was changing his vote after Indiana veterans groups had expressed concern that the resolution might endanger American forces in Venezuela. But here's what Young didn't say, and what his staff later told the Indianapolis Star. The veterans groups had been organized and funded by pro-Trump political action committees. The pressure wasn't grassroots. It was astroturfed. It was manufactured outrage, designed to give Young political cover for abandoning his constitutional oath. A Young staffer, speaking anonymously because they feared retaliation, described the senator's decision as the most difficult of his career. The staffer said Young had been getting death threats. His office phones were overwhelmed with angry calls, and his family was being harassed on social media. The staffer told the Star he didn't want to give in, but the pressure became unbearable. This isn't how the Senate is supposed to work. Let that sink in. 2 senators had just caved to a presidential intimidation campaign that included threats, bribes, and orchestrated harassment. The constitutional system was collapsing in real time. By noon on Tuesday, the mathematics had shifted completely. What started as a 52-47 rebuke of presidential overreach was now heading toward a 50-50 tie. And everyone in Washington knew what that meant. Vice President J.D. Vance would cast the tie-breaking vote at 1:47 p.m. 13 minutes before the scheduled vote, Vance arrived at the Capitol. Reporters shouted questions about how he would vote, whether he believed in congressional war powers, whether the Constitution mattered more than party loyalty. Vance ignored every question and walked directly to the Senate chamber. What happened next was the most consequential moment in American constitutional history since the Civil War. Senate Majority Leader John Thune called for the vote on the point of order against the War Powers Resolution. The point of order, if successful, would kill the resolution entirely and preserve Trump's unlimited war powers in Venezuela. The roll call began. Every Democrat voted against the point of order, trying to preserve the resolution. Every Republican except 3 voted for the point of order, trying to kill congressional oversight. Rand Paul voted against the point of order. The Kentucky Libertarian had held firm despite every threat, every attack, every pressure tactic Trump could deploy. Susan Collins voted against the point of order. The Maine moderate had chosen constitutional principle over political convenience. Lisa Murkowski voted against the point of order. The Alaska senator had refused to be intimidated by threats to her state's federal funding. The final tally, 50-50. At 2:23 p.m., Vice President J.D. Vance stood at the Senate rostrum and cast the tie-breaking vote. He voted for the point of order, killing the War Powers Resolution and preserving Trump's unchecked military authority in Venezuela. Think about what just happened. The Vice President of the United States had just voted to eliminate congressional oversight of his own administration's war powers. He had used his constitutional role to destroy constitutional checks and balances. The irony was breathtaking. The Constitution gives the Vice President the power to break Senate ties as a check on legislative gridlock. J.D. Vance had just used that power to eliminate legislative oversight of executive action. Dr. Norman Ornstein, a constitutional scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, told the New York Times, "This vote represents the complete failure of our constitutional system. When the executive branch can intimidate the legislative branch into abandoning its oversight responsibilities and then use its own constitutional powers to break the deadlock in its favor, we no longer have separation of powers. We have executive supremacy." Translation: American democracy had just failed its most basic test. Within minutes of the vote, Trump issued a victory statement from the White House. The president said the Senate had chosen American security over political gamesmanship, and that his administration would continue to protect American interests around the world without interference from Congress. But what Trump didn't say, and what constitutional experts immediately understood, was that this vote had set a precedent that would haunt American democracy for generations. Future presidents now knew they could wage war unilaterally, intimidate Congress into submission, and use their own vice president to break any ties that threatened executive power. The War Powers Resolution, designed to prevent exactly this scenario after Vietnam, had been effectively neutered. Congressional war powers, enshrined in the Constitution by the founders, had been abandoned. The separation of powers, the foundation of American democracy, had collapsed. And in Venezuela, American military forces continued their occupation without any congressional oversight, without any constitutional authorization, and without any democratic accountability. The constitutional crisis wasn't coming anymore. It had arrived. What happened in that Senate chamber wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a systematic assault on congressional authority that's been building for decades. But what makes this moment different, what makes it so dangerous, is that the assault succeeded completely. Here's what constitutional experts aren't saying out loud but are discussing in private academic circles. The War Powers Resolution has been tested many times since 1973. Presidents have pushed its boundaries, Congress has complained, courts have avoided definitive rulings, but no president has ever successfully eliminated congressional war powers entirely through intimidation and procedural manipulation. Until now.